Sometimes life breaks you in ways that never heal, leaving you to rebuild from pieces that don't quite fit together anymore. Eleanor Grace knew this truth better than most, a schoolteacher whose world changed forever when a runaway wagon crushed her dreams, along with her legs. In the frontier town of Dry Creek, she lived quietly, teaching children from her small cabin, surviving on the kindness of neighbors. Then Colt Maddox rode back into town. This giant cowboy with hands like hammers paid off all her debts and declared her his wife. But Colt didn't want Eleanor, he wanted her land, the only water-rich property for miles around. Now Eleanor faced a choice between poverty and a marriage built on lies. Could a woman who'd already lost everything find the strength to fight for her freedom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass bell sat on Eleanor Grace's desk like a monument to better days. 3 years ago, she had rung it with authority, calling children to order in the proper schoolhouse with its whitewashed walls and tall windows. Now it served a humbler purpose in her cramped cabin, summoning her 6 remaining students to lessons taught from a wooden chair with wheels that Doc Morrison had fashioned for her with careful hands and a heavy heart. Eleanor adjusted the bell's position, a habit born of the need to control something, anything, in a life that had spun far beyond her grasp. The morning sun slanted through her single window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor where little Mary Henley sat cross-legged, practicing her letters on a slate. The child's tongue poked out in concentration, and Eleanor felt that familiar warmth that teaching had always brought her, even in these reduced circumstances. "Very good, Mary," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority it had possessed in the old days. "Now remember, the letter G starts with a curve, not a straight line." Mary nodded solemnly, erasing her mistake with a damp cloth. At 8 years old, she was Eleanor's most dedicated pupil, walking 2 miles each way from her family's homestead just to spend 3 hours learning to read and write. Her mother, Mrs. Henley, paid for the lessons with eggs, fresh bread, or sometimes just the promise to mend Eleanor's worn dresses. It wasn't charity, Eleanor made sure of that. Every transaction carried dignity, a fair exchange between equals, even if the currency had changed from silver coins to acts of kindness. The cabin door creaked open, and Tommy Ferguson stuck his freckled face inside, his sandy hair wild from the morning wind. "Miss Eleanor, my pa says I can stay for arithmetic today, if you're willing to teach it." Eleanor smiled, though she noticed the careful way Tommy avoided looking at her legs, covered always by a quilt his own mother had sewn. Children adapted faster than adults to her condition, but they still carried that peculiar mix of curiosity and politeness that made them avert their eyes from what they didn't understand. "Of course, Tommy. Fetch your slate and sit beside Mary. We'll work on multiplication tables after she finishes her writing." As Tommy settled onto the floor, Eleanor reached for the small brass bell and gave it a gentle ring. The clear tone filled the cabin, and she saw Mary's face brighten at the familiar sound. It was such a small thing, this ritual of beginning, but it connected her present to her past, reminding her that she was still Eleanor Grace, still a teacher, still a woman with purpose. Doc Morrison had told her once that the mind was like a muscle, growing stronger or weaker, depending on how you used it. Eleanor's mind had grown fierce in the years since the accident, sharp as a blade from constant honing. She had to be smarter now, had to think 3 moves ahead just to accomplish what others took for granted. Getting dressed in the morning required strategy. Teaching from a chair demanded creativity. Managing her meager finances took the precision of a bank accountant. The wagon accident had happened on a Tuesday in October, 3 years past. Eleanor remembered every detail with crystalline clarity, the way the autumn leaves had been gold and red against the blue sky, how the horses had spooked at a rattlesnake, the peculiar weightless moment when she'd been thrown clear before the wagon wheel rolled over her legs. She remembered Dr. Morrison's gentle hands examining her, his careful words about crushed bones and severed nerves, the way his wife had cried when they thought Eleanor couldn't hear. What she remembered most was the silence afterward, not just the absence of sound, but the deeper quiet of a life suddenly reduced to its most essential elements. No more walking to the schoolhouse with her skirts swishing around her ankles. No more standing at the blackboard, reaching high to write lessons. No more dancing at the harvest celebrations or climbing the hill behind town to watch the sunset. In one terrible moment, her world had shrunk to the dimensions of whatever space she could reach from her chair. But Eleanor Grace had been raised by a father who believed that surrender was the only true sin, and a mother who had taught her that a woman's worth wasn't measured by her circumstances, but by her response to them. She had spent her first months of recovery learning to navigate her new reality with the same methodical approach she'd once used to teach multiplication tables. If she couldn't walk to the school, she would bring the school to her cabin. If she couldn't reach the high shelves, she would reorganize everything within arm's reach. If she couldn't dance, she would find other ways to celebrate life. The town of Dry Creek had rallied around her at first, the way small communities did when tragedy struck one of their own. Mrs. Henley had organized a fund to help with medical expenses. The blacksmith, John Ferguson, had modified her cabin door to accommodate the wheeled chair. Even stern Mr. Caldwell from the general store had extended credit without his usual grumbling about prompt payment. But charity, Eleanor had learned, was like a fire that burned bright at first and then slowly dimmed to embers. People had their own troubles, their own families to feed and protect. The donations dwindled, the visits became less frequent, and the town's attention turned to other concerns. Eleanor understood this without resentment. She had never expected the world to revolve around her misfortune, but understanding didn't make the financial reality any less pressing. The deed to her small property lay in a wooden box beside her bed, the legal document that represented her only real asset in a world where everything else had become uncertain. Water's Edge, the land was called, though few people remembered why. Eleanor's father had bought the 20 acres from a desperate settler, attracted by the reliable spring that bubbled up from underground and fed into Willow Creek. The previous owner had tried to farm the rocky soil and failed, but Eleanor's father had been wiser. He'd recognized that in this dry country, water was more precious than gold. Now, as drought threatened the region for the third consecutive year, that wisdom seemed prophetic. The spring still ran clear and cool, even when other water sources faltered. Eleanor had watched cattlemen eye her land with increasing interest, had fielded subtle inquiries about whether she might consider selling. She had politely declined them all, understanding instinctively that the land represented more than just financial security. It was her independence, her power to choose her own path in a world that offered women precious few choices. Tommy finished his slate work and held it up for inspection, his face bright with pride. Eleanor examined his arithmetic with the same careful attention she would have given to a university examination, making small marks with her pencil where he needed to carry numbers or double-check his addition. "Excellent work, Tommy. Your father will be proud when you show him these problems solved correctly." The boy beamed and carefully cleaned his slate, preparing for the next set of exercises. Mary had moved on to reading practice, sounding out words from a worn primer that Eleanor had salvaged from the abandoned schoolhouse. The official school had closed 6 months after Eleanor's accident, when the territorial government decided that Dry Creek was too small to warrant a certified teacher and a proper building. The children now had to travel 15 miles to Canyon Ridge for formal education, a journey that few families could afford to make regularly. So Eleanor's cabin school had become an unofficial necessity, filling a gap that the government had left empty. She taught the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, and enough geography and history to help her students understand the world beyond their small town. It wasn't the comprehensive education she had once provided, but it was enough to give these children a foundation upon which to build their futures. As the morning wore on, more students arrived. Samuel Cruz brought news that his family's well was running dangerously low, and his mother wondered if Eleanor might know of any other water sources in the area. Rebecca Thompson came with a question about a word she'd encountered in her father's newspaper and stayed to help Mary with her penmanship. Each child brought a small piece of the outside world into Eleanor's cabin, keeping her connected to the life of the community, even as her own circumstances kept her somewhat apart from it. Around noon, when the heat grew too oppressive for concentrated study, Eleanor dismissed her students with assignments to complete at home. She watched them file out into the bright sunlight, their voices carrying back to her as they scattered toward their various homes and chores. The cabin fell silent except for the ticking of her father's old clock and the distant sound of Willow Creek flowing past her property line. Eleanor rolled her chair to the window and gazed out at the landscape that had shaped her entire life. The town of Dry Creek stretched along the valley floor, its collection of weathered buildings connected by dusty roads and the shared struggles of frontier living. Beyond the town, the prairie rolled away toward distant mountains, vast and empty under the endless sky. It was beautiful in its harsh way, this land that demanded everything of the people who tried to make a life upon it. She was still sitting at the window when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching on the main road, a single rider, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in the saddle. Eleanor didn't recognize the horse, a big bay stallion with the look of an animal that had traveled far and hard, but something about the rider's posture made her pay closer attention. The man was large, even at a distance. His shoulders filled out a dark coat that had seen better days, and his hat was pulled low against the sun. He rode like someone who had spent most of his life on horseback, moving with his mount as if they were parts of the same creature. As he drew closer to town, Eleanor could see other people emerging from their homes and businesses, drawn by the same curiosity that had captured her attention. Strangers were common enough in Dry Creek. The town sat on a cattle trail that brought drovers and drifters through on a regular basis. But something about this particular rider seemed to generate more interest than usual. Eleanor watched Mrs. Henley step out of the bakery, shading her eyes with her hand. Mr. Ferguson emerged from his blacksmith shop, hammer still in his grip. Even old Mr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway of his general store, his expression more alert than Eleanor had seen it in months. The rider reached the main street and dismounted outside the Silver Dollar Saloon with smooth, practiced motions. He tied his horse to the hitching post and removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that needed cutting. Even from her window, Eleanor could see that he was younger than his confident bearing had suggested, perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the open sky. She was about to turn away from the window when the stranger looked directly toward her cabin. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, their eyes met across the distance. Eleanor felt a peculiar jolt, as if lightning had touched down somewhere close by. The man's gaze was steady, measuring, and somehow familiar, though she was certain they had never met. Then he replaced his hat and pushed through the saloon doors, disappearing into the building's cool shadows. Eleanor remained at the window, though the street had returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Something about that brief exchange had unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a sense of change approaching the way the air felt before a thunderstorm, charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. The brass bell on her desk caught the afternoon light, throwing small rainbows across the cabin walls. Eleanor reached for it and gave it one soft ring, the sound somehow less comforting than it had been that morning. Change was coming to Dry Creek. She could feel it in her bones, the way some people felt weather. Whether that change would bring salvation or ruin remained to be seen. The stranger's name was Colt Maddox, and by sunset, every soul in Dry Creek knew it. Eleanor learned this from Mrs. Henley, who arrived at her cabin door with a basket of still warm bread and gossip that seemed to burn even hotter. "Maddox," Mrs. Henley repeated, settling her considerable bulk into Eleanor's spare chair with the satisfaction of someone delivering momentous news. "That's what he told Sam at the saloon. Claims he's been working cattle drives down in Texas, but folks remember his family used to have a spread north of here. Lost it in the drought of '89. Eleanor accepted the bread with genuine gratitude, though her mind was still caught on that moment when the stranger's eyes had found hers across the distance. Colt Maddox. The name fit him somehow sharp and uncompromising, like the man himself had appeared to be. "What's he want in Dry Creek?" Eleanor asked, though something deep in her chest suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. Mrs. Henley leaned forward, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper she reserved for the most scandalous gossip. "That's just it, dear. He's been asking questions. About land, about water rights, about who owns what, and who might be willing to sell." She paused dramatically. "And he's been asking about you." The words hit Eleanor like cold water. "About me?" "Specifically about you, your property, and your circumstances." Mrs. Henley's expression grew troubled. "Eleanor, honey, I don't like the way this feels. A man like that doesn't ride into town asking questions unless he's got plans." Eleanor's hands tightened on the wheels of her chair. Through her window, she could see the lights beginning to flicker on in the town's windows as families gathered for their evening meals. It looked peaceful, ordinary, but Mrs. Henley's words had introduced a discordant note that made everything feel suddenly fragile. "What sort of plans could he have with me? I barely have enough money to feed myself, let alone interest a cattle driver." Mrs. Henley reached across and patted Eleanor's hand with maternal concern. "Oh, child, sometimes I think you don't realize what you have. That spring of yours, that water, it's worth more than money in a drought year, and everyone knows it but you." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of heavy boots on her porch steps made both women fall silent. Mrs. Henley's face went pale, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. The footsteps had a deliberate quality, unhurried but purposeful, like someone who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. A knock came at the door, 3 solid raps that seemed to echo through the small cabin. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Henley, who was already rising from her chair with the protective instincts of a mother hen. "I'll send him on his way," Mrs. Henley whispered, but Eleanor shook her head. "No, if he has business with me, I'd rather know what it is." Eleanor rolled her chair to the door and opened it to find Colt Maddox standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking even larger up close than he had from her window. He was well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his dark coat and hands that appeared capable of crushing stone. His face was weathered but not unkind, marked by years of sun and wind, but softened by eyes that were a surprising shade of deep blue. "Miss Grace," he said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone who had spent time in the Southern Territories. "I'm Colt Maddox. I was hoping we might have a word." Eleanor studied his face, searching for some hint of his intentions. He had removed his hat out of respect, she noticed, and his posture was polite, despite his intimidating size. Still, there was something in his manner that suggested this conversation was inevitable rather than optional. "Mr. Maddox," she replied, keeping her voice steady, "I understand you've been asking questions about me around town." A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "Word travels fast in a small place. Yes, ma'am, I have. Might I come in? What I have to say isn't really porch conversation." Eleanor hesitated, acutely aware of Mrs. Henley hovering protectively behind her. Everything about this situation felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward would change everything forever. "I suppose you'd better come in," she said finally, backing her chair away from the door. Colt Maddox stepped into her cabin and immediately seemed to fill it, not just with his physical presence, but with an energy that made the familiar space feel smaller and more charged. He nodded politely to Mrs. Henley, who regarded him with the suspicion of a guard dog, then turned his attention back to Eleanor. "I'll speak plain, Miss Grace, because I figure you're a woman who appreciates honesty." He paused, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "I've come to marry you." The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to reach every corner of the room. "Mrs. Henley," gasped audibly, and Eleanor felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. "I beg your pardon?" Eleanor managed, certain she had misheard. "I've come to marry you," Colt repeated calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. "I know it sounds sudden, but I've given this considerable thought. You need security, and I need what you have to offer." Eleanor's mind reeled. "Mr. Maddox, I don't know what you think I have to offer, but I can assure you that marriage is not something I'm considering. With anyone." Colt reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, which he held out to her. Eleanor hesitated before taking it, and as she unfolded the document, her heart sank. It was a statement of debt, itemizing every loan, every extended credit, every favor that had kept her afloat over the past 3 years. The final figure at the bottom made her hands tremble. "How did you get this?" she whispered. "I bought your debts, Miss Grace. Every last one of them. From Doc Morrison's medical bills to Mr. Caldwell's store credit. It's all mine now, and according to the terms, it's all due immediately." Eleanor stared at the paper, the numbers blurring as she tried to process what this meant. The total was more than she could earn in 5 years of teaching, more money than she had ever seen in one place. She was ruined, completely and utterly ruined. "You can't do this," Mrs. Henley said, her voice shaking with outrage. "Those debts were given in good faith, with understanding." "The debts are legal and binding," Colt interrupted, though not unkindly. "I've done nothing improper. I simply consolidated Miss Grace's obligations under my ownership." Eleanor looked up from the paper, her mind racing through possibilities and finding no escape. "Why? Why would you do this?" "Because I need a wife, and you need someone to take care of your financial troubles. It seems like a practical arrangement." "A practical arrangement," Eleanor repeated, her voice hollow. "Mr. Maddox, I don't love you. I don't even know you." "Love is a luxury, Miss Grace. Survival is a necessity." Colt's expression remained calm, but she caught something else in his eyes, not cruelty, but a kind of weary determination. "I'm not asking for love. I'm offering a solution to both our problems." "What problems could you possibly have that require marrying a woman you've never met?" For the first time, Colt's composure seemed to crack slightly. He looked away from her, his jaw tightening. "Let's just say that a man in my position benefits from appearing settled and respectable." Eleanor felt a chill of understanding. "You're in trouble. With the law." "Nothing like that," Colt said quickly, then paused. "It's complicated. There are people who need to see that I have roots, responsibilities. A wife provides that appearance." Mrs. Henley stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Eleanor, you don't have to listen to this. We'll find another way." "What other way?" Eleanor asked quietly, still staring at the debt statement. "Mrs. Henley, look at these numbers. Even if the whole town contributed, we couldn't raise this kind of money. And Mr. Maddox owns the debts now. He can demand payment whenever he chooses." "The offer is simple," Colt said, his voice gentler now. "Marry me, and the debts disappear. You keep your land, your home, your independence. In return, you provide me with the respectability of marriage. And if I refuse, then I'll have no choice but to collect what's owed. The land would have to be sold to cover the debts. You'd lose everything." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her small world closing in around her. She had fought so hard to maintain her dignity, her independence, her sense of self-worth after the accident. Now this stranger was offering to preserve those things, but at a price that felt like selling her soul. "How do I know you won't just take my land anyway, once we're married?" "Because I'm not interested in your land, Miss Grace. I'm interested in appearances. A man who steals from his disabled wife doesn't look respectable. He looks like a monster." The word disabled hung in the air between them, and Eleanor realized that Colt Maddox was the first person in 3 years to use that term without flinching or immediately softening it with euphemisms. There was something almost refreshing about his bluntness, even in these circumstances. "I need time to think," Eleanor said finally. "Of course, but not too much time. I'd like to have this settled within the week." Colt replaced his hat and moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. For just a moment, his expression softened, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of something almost like regret in his blue eyes. "For what it's worth, Miss Grace, I don't take any pleasure in this situation. But sometimes life doesn't give us the choices we want, only the choices we can live with." After he left, Eleanor and Mrs. Henley sat in silence for a long time, the debt statement still clutched in Eleanor's hands. Finally, Mrs. Henley spoke. "There has to be another way, Eleanor. We can't let him force you into this." Eleanor smoothed the paper against her lap, studying the careful handwriting that documented her financial ruin. "He's not forcing me, Mrs. Henley. He's offering me a choice between 2 kinds of prison. At least this way, I get to keep my home. But marriage to a stranger, a man who could be dangerous, could be," Eleanor agreed. "But losing everything is a certainty. And you heard him, he needs respectability more than he needs to hurt me. That gives me some protection." Mrs. Henley's face crumpled with worry and sympathy. "Oh, my dear child, how did it come to this?" Eleanor looked out her window at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of her spring bubbling up from the earth, the water that had made her land valuable and herself a target. "It came to this," she said softly, "because I forgot that in this world, even a woman who asks for nothing is still asking for too much." Eleanor's mother's wedding ring felt heavier than lead as she slipped it onto her finger 3 days later. The simple gold band had been her only inheritance of real value, saved for the day when she would marry for love rather than survival. Now, as she prepared to walk, or rather, roll down the makeshift aisle in the community hall, the ring seemed to mock every dream she had ever held about marriage and family. The ceremony was a hurried affair, conducted by a traveling preacher who had arrived in Dry Creek the previous evening. Reverend Mills was a kind man with gentle eyes who had clearly been troubled by the circumstances of the union, but Eleanor had assured him that she was entering the marriage of her own free will. It wasn't entirely a lie she had chosen this path, even if her choices had been severely limited. Mrs. Henley had insisted on preparing Eleanor for the occasion, braiding her hair with wildflowers that Mary had picked that morning, and lending her a cream-colored dress that had been altered to accommodate her seated position. Eleanor caught her reflection in the mirror and saw a woman who looked composed and dignified, though her eyes held shadows that no amount of preparation could hide. Colt stood at the front of the hall, wearing a clean black suit that made him look even more imposing than usual. He had shaved and combed his hair, transforming himself from a rough cowboy into something approaching a gentleman. When Eleanor rolled her chair down the aisle, guided by Doc Morrison, who had volunteered to give her away, Colt's expression remained carefully neutral, though she thought she detected a flicker of something guilt, perhaps in his blue eyes. The vows were brief and businesslike. Eleanor spoke her promises in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the small hall, while Colt's responses were equally measured and formal. When Reverend Mills pronounced them husband and wife, Colt leaned down to brush a chaste kiss across Eleanor's cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle for such large hands. The reception that followed was subdued, attended mostly by the families whose children Eleanor taught. People offered congratulations that felt forced and concerned glances that felt genuine. Eleanor accepted their well wishes with grace, playing the role of a satisfied bride, even as part of her soul seemed to shrivel with each false smile. Colt said little during the celebration, standing beside her chair with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting. He spoke politely to anyone who approached, but Eleanor noticed that his answers were carefully non-committal, revealing nothing about his plans or intentions beyond the marriage itself. As the afternoon wore on, reality began to settle around Eleanor like a heavy blanket. She was married now, bound by law and custom to a man she barely knew. Tonight, she would leave her familiar cabin and move to Colt's ranch house, trading her independence for financial security and the protection of his name. The ranch house sat 3 miles outside of town, a sturdy structure built of local stone and timber. Colt had driven her there in a wagon modified with a ramp that allowed her to transfer from her chair more easily, a consideration that surprised her with its thoughtfulness. As they approached the house, Eleanor could see that it was larger than her cabin, but showed signs of neglect, as if its owner had been absent for long periods. "The house needs work," Colt said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them during the drive. "I've been on the trail for most of the past 2 years. Haven't had time for proper maintenance." Eleanor studied the building's weathered exterior, noting the loose shutters and overgrown garden. "It has good bones," she said diplomatically. "A house just needs someone to care for it. That's what I'm hoping." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely, but his expression remained unreadable as he guided the wagon up to the front porch. The ramp he had built was clearly new, the wood still pale and unweathered. He had planned for her arrival, she realized, planned for the practicalities of living with a wife who couldn't walk. Inside, the house was spartanly furnished but clean. The main room contained a fireplace, a dining table, and several chairs that looked handmade. A kitchen area occupied one corner, equipped with a wood-burning stove and basic cookware. Colt had clearly made an effort to prepare the space, though it still felt more like a temporary camp than a home. "Your room is through there," Colt said, indicating a door near the kitchen. "I've set it up so you can manage everything from your chair. There's a bell by the bed if you need anything during the night." Eleanor rolled to the doorway and peered inside. The room was small but adequate, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the distant mountains. Colt had installed rails along the walls to help her navigate, and the bed was positioned at a height that would allow her to transfer from her chair. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched by the considerations he had made. "This is thoughtful." "I'm not a monster, Eleanor," Colt said quietly. "This arrangement benefits both of us, but that doesn't mean I intend to make you miserable." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice created an unexpected intimacy that made her cheeks warm. She turned her chair to face him, studying his expression in the lamplight. "What do you expect from this marriage, Colt? What are the rules we're living by?" He considered her question seriously, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "I expect respect and cooperation. You'll maintain the appearance of being a willing wife when we're in public. Beyond that, your time is your own. You can continue teaching if you want. The children can come here instead of to your cabin." "And what about—" Eleanor hesitated, then forced herself to continue. "What about the physical aspects of marriage?" Colt's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on his arms. "That's not part of this arrangement unless you decide otherwise. Your privacy and your choices remain your own." The relief that flooded through Eleanor was so strong it made her dizzy. She had been dreading this conversation, fearing that Colt's concept of marriage would include demands she wasn't prepared to meet. His assurance that he expected nothing physical from her removed the largest source of her anxiety about their arrangement. "Why?" she asked. "Most men would consider that part of their rights as a husband. Most men don't enter into marriages of convenience with women they've forced into the arrangement." Colt's voice carried a note of self-awareness that surprised her. "I may be desperate, Eleanor, but I'm not a brute." As the evening progressed, Eleanor began to see glimpses of the man beneath Colt's carefully controlled exterior. He was clearly intelligent, speaking knowledgeably about cattle, land management, and the economic challenges facing ranchers in the territory. He was also surprisingly well-read, mentioning books and authors that Eleanor wouldn't have expected a cowboy to know. They shared a simple dinner of bread, cheese, and preserved meat, eating in a silence that was more comfortable than Eleanor had anticipated. Colt proved to be a considerate companion, ensuring that everything she needed was within reach and asking polite questions about her teaching methods and her students. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the children's education," he said as they finished eating. "If they're going to come here for lessons, we should set up a proper classroom. The front room gets good light in the morning." Eleanor looked around the main room, imagining how it might be arranged to accommodate her students. "That would work well. We'd need more chairs and some kind of blackboard. I can build whatever you need. I'm better with tools than I am with conversation." There was something almost shy in the way he said this, and Eleanor found herself smiling for the first time since their wedding ceremony. "I appreciate that. The children will be excited to have more space for their lessons." As night fell, they settled into an evening routine that felt surprisingly natural. Colt banked the fire and checked the doors while Eleanor prepared for bed, transferring to her room with practiced efficiency. She had been dreading this first night, uncertain what to expect from her new husband, but Colt's behavior remained perfectly proper, bidding her good night from the doorway before retreating to his own room at the opposite end of the house. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and tried to process the dramatic changes that had reshaped her life in a matter of days. She was married now, living in a house that felt more like a business arrangement than a home, bound to a man whose motivations remained largely mysterious. Yet she was also free from debt, secure in her property ownership, and able to continue teaching her students. The wedding ring on her finger caught the moonlight streaming through her window, and Eleanor twisted it slowly around her finger. Her mother had worn this ring for 32 years, through good times and hardships, binding herself to a man she had loved deeply and completely. Eleanor wondered what her mother would think of this practical marriage, this arrangement that secured survival at the cost of romance. Outside her window, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch, the gentle lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the grass, the distant howl of a coyote. It was peaceful in a way that her cabin in town had never been, isolated enough to provide true quiet, but secure enough to feel safe. From somewhere in the house came the sound of Colt moving around, his heavy footsteps muffled by the wooden floors. Eleanor found herself listening to these sounds, trying to learn the rhythms of his evening routine. He seemed to be a man of methodical habits, checking and double-checking things before settling down for the night. A soft knock came at her door, and Eleanor's heart jumped before Colt's voice reassured her. "Eleanor, I forgot to mention Miguel will be coming by in the morning to help with some repairs around the house. He's been working for me for several years, and he's trustworthy. I thought you should know to expect him." "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor replied, oddly touched that he had thought to warn her about the visitor. "Sleep well," Colt said, and she heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. Eleanor pulled the quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes, trying to quiet the turmoil of thoughts and emotions that threatened to keep her awake. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adjustments, but for tonight, she was safe and secure in a way she hadn't been since her accident. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was a life she could live with dignity and purpose. The gold ring seemed to grow warmer against her skin as sleep finally claimed her, and in her dreams, Eleanor's mother smiled and whispered words of understanding that faded with the dawn. Eleanor discovered the water survey map by accident on her third morning as Mrs. Maddox while searching for writing paper in Colt's desk drawer. The document was folded neatly beneath a stack of cattle receipts, its edges worn from handling. As she unfolded it, her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The map showed her property, Water's Edge, in meticulous detail, including the spring, the creek bed, and underground water channels she hadn't even known existed. Someone had marked the survey with measurements, calculations, and notes about water flow rates during different seasons. But what made Eleanor's hands tremble was the date on the map. It was nearly 6 months old, created long before Colt had ever approached her about marriage. She stared at the document, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't the impulsive decision of a desperate man. It was a carefully planned campaign. Colt had been studying her property, analyzing its water resources, and plotting his approach for months. The marriage proposal, the bought debts, even his knowledge of her financial troubles, all of it had been orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. "Mrs. Maddox?" A gentle voice from the kitchen doorway made Eleanor start. Miguel Vasquez stood there with his hat in his hands, his weathered face creased with concern. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor quickly refolded the map, her heart hammering against her ribs. Miguel was Colt's ranch hand, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands who had been nothing but respectful to her since arriving that morning. She had been grateful for his presence, appreciating his quiet courtesy and the way he had modified several areas of the house to better accommodate her chair. "I'm fine, Miguel. Just looking for some writing paper for my students' lessons." Miguel's eyes flicked to the map in her hands, and she saw recognition cross his features before he carefully looked away. "Mr. Colt keeps his correspondence materials in the kitchen cabinet," he said diplomatically. "Would you like me to show you?" Eleanor nodded, slipping the map into her skirt pocket as she followed Miguel to the kitchen. He opened a cabinet to reveal neat stacks of paper, pens, and ink, everything she needed for her teaching. But her mind was no longer on lesson plans. "Miguel," she said carefully, "how long have you known my husband?" The older man busied himself with arranging some tools on the counter, not meeting her eyes. "About 3 years, Senora, since he came back from Texas." "And has he always been interested in water rights and land surveys?" Miguel's hands stilled on the tools. For a long moment, he seemed to wrestle with some internal conflict. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression grave. "Mrs. Maddox, it is not my place to speak of my employer's business. But you know something," Eleanor pressed. "Miguel, I'm his wife now. Don't I have a right to understand what I've married into?" Miguel sighed heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. "Mr. Colt is not a bad man, Senora, but he has been carrying heavy burdens for a long time. Sometimes, when a man is desperate enough, he makes choices that he might not make otherwise." "What kind of burdens?" Before Miguel could answer, the sound of hoofbeats announced Colt's return from his morning ride. Miguel immediately busied himself with his work, and Eleanor wheeled herself to the window to watch her husband dismount from his bay stallion. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved with the controlled energy of a man holding himself in check. Colt entered the house with his usual quiet efficiency, hanging his hat on a peg by the door and nodding to Miguel before turning his attention to Eleanor. "Good morning. I trust you slept well?" "Well enough," Eleanor replied, studying his face for any sign of deception. In the bright morning light, she could see details she had missed before: the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of worry, the slight scar along his jaw, the way his mouth tightened when he thought no one was watching. "I've been thinking about the classroom setup," Colt continued, seemingly oblivious to her scrutiny. "If we move the dining table closer to the window and add some benches, it should accommodate all your students comfortably." Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, feeling the crinkle of the folded map. "That's very thoughtful. You seem to have given this a great deal of consideration." Something flickered in Colt's expression so quickly that she might have imagined it. "I believe in being thorough when I commit to something." "Yes," Eleanor said slowly. "I'm beginning to understand that about you." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Colt frowned, clearly not expecting visitors, and went to answer it. Eleanor heard voices, Colt's low rumble, and a higher, more agitated tone that sounded familiar. A moment later, Colt returned with Mrs. Henley, whose face was flushed with exertion and worry. "Eleanor, dear, thank goodness you're all right." "Mrs." Henley said, hurrying to Eleanor's side. "I've been so worried about you. Out here all alone with... She stopped herself, glancing at Colt with obvious discomfort. "I'm perfectly fine, Mrs. Henley," Eleanor assured her, though her heart warmed at the older woman's concern. Colt has been nothing but courteous. Mrs. Henley's expression suggested she found this hard to believe. "Well, I brought you some of my apple preserves, and I wanted to discuss the children's lessons. Some of the parents are concerned about the change in location." Eleanor glanced at Colt, who had withdrawn to give them privacy, but was clearly listening to every word. "What kind of concerns?" "Oh, you know how people talk," Mrs. Henley said, lowering her voice. "They're worried about the children traveling this far from town, especially with winter coming on. And there are questions about whether the arrangement is whether it's proper." "Proper?" Eleanor felt a flash of anger. "What exactly are they suggesting?" Mrs. Henley fidgeted with her shawl, clearly uncomfortable. "Some folks are wondering if this marriage is legitimate, or if it's just a business arrangement of some kind. They're concerned about the influence on the children." The words stung because they were so close to the truth. Eleanor was aware of Colt stiffening across the room, his hands clenching slightly at his sides. The fiction of their happy marriage was apparently not as convincing as they had hoped. "The marriage is completely legitimate," Eleanor said firmly. "Whatever arrangement Colt and I have made is between us, and it doesn't affect my ability to teach their children." "Of course, dear. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that people are talking, and..." "People always talk, Mrs. Henley," Colt interjected, moving back toward them with deliberate calm. "Usually about things they don't understand. My wife's reputation is impeccable, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." There was something quietly menacing in the way he said this, and Mrs. Henley actually took a step backward. Eleanor felt a complex mix of emotions, gratitude that he was defending her, but also unease at the implied threat in his words. "I'm sure Mr. Maddox didn't mean that the way it sounded," Eleanor said diplomatically. "Mrs. Henley, please tell the parents that the children are welcome to continue their lessons here, but I understand if some families prefer to make other arrangements." After Mrs. Henley left, Eleanor found herself alone with Colt in a silence that felt charged with unspoken tensions. She could feel the weight of the map in her pocket, the evidence of his deception burning against her leg like a brand. "You handled that well," Colt said finally. "Thank you for defending our marriage." "Our marriage," Eleanor repeated. "Is that what this is, Colt? A marriage? Or is it something else entirely?" Colt's expression grew wary. "What do you mean?" Eleanor pulled the map from her pocket and unfolded it on the table between them. Colt's face went completely still, and she saw his jaw tighten as he recognized the document. "I found this in your desk," Eleanor said quietly, "dated 6 months ago. 6 months before you ever approached me about marriage." Colt stared at the map for a long moment, then raised his eyes to meet hers. "I see. Is that all you have to say?" "I see." Eleanor's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "You've been planning this for months, Colt. Studying my property, calculating my water resources, probably tracking my debts, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This whole marriage is built on lies." "Not lies," Colt said carefully, "just incomplete truths. Don't play word games with me." Eleanor's anger finally broke free, and she slammed her hand down on the table. "You manipulated me into this marriage under false pretenses. You made me believe you were desperate and impulsive when you're actually calculating and methodical. What else haven't you told me?" Colt moved to the window, staring out at the landscape for several moments before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "You're right. I did plan this. I've been watching your situation for months, waiting for the right opportunity. But that doesn't change the fundamental truth. We both needed something, and this arrangement provides it." "What do you need, Colt? Really? Because it's obviously not just respectability." Colt was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he wouldn't answer. Finally, he turned back to face her, and she was surprised to see vulnerability in his expression. "Water rights," he said simply. Not to your property directly, but access to the underground system that feeds your spring. My family's ranch, the one I lost in '89, it's been bought by Eastern investors who want to develop it. But they need guaranteed water access to make their plans work. And marrying me gives you that access? As your husband, I have legal standing to negotiate water-sharing agreements that would benefit both properties. The investors have offered me a partnership if I can secure those rights. Colt's voice grew quieter. It's my chance to get back what my family lost. Eleanor, my chance to rebuild something that mattered. Eleanor stared at him, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. The respectability story, that was a lie too. Not entirely. The investors do want to see that I'm settled and responsible, but mostly they want the water rights. The honesty in his admission was somehow more devastating than the original deception. Eleanor felt something inside her chest crumble, not love, because she had never loved him, but perhaps the hope that their arrangement might someday become something real. So I'm just a means to an end, she said softly, a way for you to reclaim your family's legacy. Eleanor. No. Eleanor held up her hand to stop him. I understand now. You saw a vulnerable woman with valuable property, and you executed a plan to acquire what you needed. It was brilliant. Really. Ruthless, but brilliant. Colt's face had gone pale beneath his tan. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. When I first started planning this, you were just a problem to be solved. But after meeting you, after seeing how you've handled everything that's happened to you, what? You started to feel guilty about manipulating me? I started to respect you, Colt said quietly. You're stronger than I expected, braver, more intelligent. When I bought those debts, I thought I was dealing with a helpless woman who would be grateful for any escape. Instead, I found someone who had built a meaningful life from the pieces of a broken one. Eleanor felt tears threatening and forced them back. She would not cry in front of this man who had played her so skillfully. Your respect doesn't change what you've done, Colt. It doesn't change the fact that you've trapped me in a marriage based on deception. You're right, Colt admitted, and I'm sorry for that. But Eleanor, the situation is more complicated than you know. Those Eastern investors, they're not just interested in development. They want to control the water rights for the entire valley. If they succeed, every small ranch and farm in the area will be at their mercy, including the town's water supply. Including the town's water supply. Colt moved closer to her, his expression intense. Your spring isn't just valuable for irrigation, Eleanor. In a drought year, it could be the difference between Dry Creek surviving or becoming a ghost town. Eleanor stared at him, her anger warring with a growing understanding of the larger stakes involved. So you're saying you manipulated me to save the town? I'm saying I saw an opportunity to protect something larger than either of us, and I took it. The method was questionable, but the goal was honorable. Don't you dare try to make yourself into a hero, Eleanor said sharply. Heroes don't prey on disabled women and force them into unwanted marriages. The words hit Colt like a physical blow, and Eleanor saw him flinch. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked completely, and she glimpsed the pain and guilt he had been hiding beneath his pragmatic exterior. You're right, he said hoarsely. There's no justification for what I've done to you. I told myself it was necessary, that the ends justified the means, but that was just cowardice talking. I was afraid to risk everything on a direct approach, so I took the certain path instead. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Eleanor wasn't sure she wanted to cross. She could feel her anger beginning to ebb, replaced by something more complex and harder to define. Colt's deception had been calculated and cruel, but his willingness to confess the truth now suggested that perhaps there was more to him than she had realized. What happens now? Eleanor asked finally. Now that I know the truth about why you married me. Colt studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. That depends on you. You could have the marriage annulled, claim coercion or fraud. You'd lose the financial security, but you'd regain your freedom. And you'd lose your water rights and your partnership with the investors. Yes, Eleanor considered this, turning the possibilities over in her mind like stones. Or we could continue as we are. I would still need your cooperation to negotiate the water-sharing agreements, but now you'd know exactly what you were agreeing to. You could be a partner in the decision rather than a victim of it. A partner, Eleanor repeated slowly, with full knowledge of the terms and the right to refuse, with full knowledge and full veto power over any agreement that affects your property. Eleanor wheeled her chair to the window, looking out at the land that had become the center of so much conflict and calculation. The autumn sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that made the harsh landscape look almost beautiful. Why should I trust you now, Colt? How do I know this isn't just another manipulation, another layer of the plan? Because I'm giving you information that could destroy everything I've worked for, Colt said quietly. If I were still manipulating you, I would have kept the truth hidden and continued playing the role of the reformed cowboy, trying to build a respectable life. Eleanor turned back to face him, studying his expression in the fading light. There was something different about him now, a rawness that hadn't been there before, as if the act of confessing had stripped away some essential defense. I need time to think, she said finally. This changes everything between us, and I need to understand what my options really are. Of course, Colt nodded. Take all the time you need. In the meantime, our arrangement continues as before. You have my word that I won't pressure you for a decision. Your word, Eleanor said with bitter humor. Forgive me if I find that somewhat lacking in value at the moment. Colt's face tightened, but he didn't argue the point. I understand. Actions will have to speak louder than words from now on. As evening fell around them, Eleanor retreated to her room with her mind churning. The map lay on her dresser, its carefully drawn lines representing not just geographical features, but the complex web of motives and manipulations that had brought her to this point. She was married to a man who had deceived her from the beginning, trapped in an arrangement that served his purposes more than her own. Yet she was also, she realized, in a position of unexpected power. Colt needed her cooperation to achieve his goals, and now that she understood the true stakes, she could make informed decisions about how to proceed. The naive woman who had accepted his marriage proposal out of desperation was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly what she was worth and why. Outside her window, the night sounds of the ranch provided a familiar backdrop to her thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sharp, dangerous pleasure of having real choices to make. For the first time since her accident, she was not just surviving, but actively shaping her own destiny. The wedding ring on her finger caught the moonlight, and Eleanor twisted it slowly, thinking of her mother's long and loving marriage. Perhaps this arrangement would never become what her parents had shared, but it might become something else entirely, a partnership built on mutual need and grudging respect rather than love and trust. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was a life she could live with dignity and purpose. And now, at least, she would be living it with her eyes wide open. The carved wooden horse sat on Eleanor's new classroom table like a sentinel from another life. Her father had whittled it during the long winter evenings of her childhood, his weathered hands shaping the pine with patient strokes, while Eleanor watched from her place by the fireplace. Now, as she arranged the makeshift classroom in Colt's front room, the small figure seemed to represent everything she had lost and everything she was fighting to preserve. 3 weeks had passed since her confrontation with Colt about the water survey map, 3 weeks of careful politeness and unspoken tensions. They moved around each other in the house like dancers, following an intricate choreography designed to maintain distance while sharing the same space. Colt kept his word about not pressuring her for a decision, but Eleanor could feel his watchful attention in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't aware. The children had begun arriving for lessons, despite the concerns their parents had expressed to Mrs. Henley. Mary was first, as always, carrying her slate, and wearing the serious expression that made her seem older than her 8 years. Tommy Ferguson followed, his freckled face bright with curiosity about the ranch and its animals. One by one, the others trickled in, until Eleanor had 6 students arranged on the benches that Colt had built with his own hands. "Miss Eleanor," Mary said, raising her hand with the formal politeness Eleanor had taught her, "my mama wants to know if you're happy living out here." Eleanor paused in writing arithmetic problems on the slate board Colt had mounted on the wall. The question was innocent enough, but she could hear the adult concerns behind it, the same worries that had driven Mrs. Henley's visit. "I'm content, Mary," Eleanor said carefully. "This is my home now, and I'm grateful to have you all here for lessons." "My pa says Mr. Maddox is dangerous," piped up Samuel Cruz, the youngest at 6 years old. "Says he's got a reputation." "Samuel," Eleanor said gently but firmly, "it's not polite to repeat gossip, especially about someone who has opened his home to your education." She caught movement in the doorway and saw Colt standing there, his expression unreadable as he listened to the children's chatter. He had returned early from checking the cattle, and Eleanor wondered how much of the conversation he had overheard. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "would you like to meet my students properly?" Colt hesitated, then stepped into the room with the careful movements of a large man, trying not to frighten small children. The students regarded him with wide eyes, taking in his imposing height and broad shoulders with the frank curiosity of youth. "Children, this is my husband, Mr. Maddox. He's the one who built these benches and the board you're learning from." "You're really big," Mary observed with typical childhood directness. A smile tugged at the corner of Colt's mouth. "Yes, I suppose I am. My mother used to say I got more than my share of growing." "Can you lift a whole cow?" Tommy asked, his eyes bright with wonder. "Not a whole cow," Colt replied seriously, "but I can lift a calf if it needs help." The children peppered him with questions about the ranch, the cattle, and his life on the trail. Eleanor watched with growing amazement as Colt patiently answered each query, his voice gentling as he spoke to them. This was a side of her husband she had never seen, patient, almost tender, with none of the controlled tension that characterized his interactions with adults. "Do you know how to read?" Rebecca Thompson asked, and Eleanor felt the room grow quiet. Literacy was still uncommon among working men, and the question could be seen as impertinent. "I do," Colt said without embarrassment. "My mother taught me before she died. She believed education was important, even for boys who were destined for ranch work." "What's your favorite book?" Mary asked, leaning forward with interest. Colt considered this seriously. "I've always been partial to Robinson Crusoe. There's something appealing about a man who builds a life from nothing through his own determination and resourcefulness." Eleanor felt a jolt of surprise. She wouldn't have expected Colt to be familiar with Defoe's classic, much less to find personal meaning in it. The revelation added another layer to her growing understanding of the man she had married. "Miss Eleanor reads to us sometimes," Samuel said. "She has a real nice voice for stories." "I'm sure she does," Colt replied, his eyes meeting Eleanor's briefly before returning to the children. "Reading aloud is a gift not everyone possesses." After the children left for the day, Eleanor found herself alone with Colt in the kitchen, sharing the afternoon coffee that had become part of their routine. The conversation with the students seemed to have softened something between them, creating a space for easier interaction. "You were good with them," Eleanor said, pouring coffee into his cup. "They liked you." "Children are honest judges of character," Colt replied. "They see through pretense more easily than adults." "What did they see in you, do you think?" Colt stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Someone who respects them enough to answer their questions seriously. Children appreciate that." Eleanor studied his profile as he gazed out the kitchen window. "You mentioned your mother teaching you to read. What happened to her?" "Fever, when I was 12. She died the same winter we lost most of our cattle to the blizzard." Colt's voice carried old grief, carefully contained but never forgotten. "My father blamed himself for not being able to save either the stock or his wife. He never quite recovered from the guilt. Is that why you're so determined to rebuild what your family lost? Partly. Colt looked at her directly, but mostly because I believe some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight isn't fair or pretty. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Colt immediately tensed, moving to the window with the alertness of a man accustomed to trouble. Eleanor saw his hand drift unconsciously toward the gun he wore at his hip. "You expecting someone?" she asked. "No," Colt said grimly. "Stay here." Eleanor ignored the instruction and wheeled her chair to where she could see out the front window. 3 men on horseback were approaching the house, their posture suggesting business rather than a social call. They were well dressed in the manner of town professionals, but something about their bearing made Eleanor's skin crawl. Colt stepped onto the porch to meet them, and Eleanor positioned herself where she could hear the conversation through the open door. "Mr. Maddox," the lead rider said in a smooth voice that carried an undertone of threat. "I'm James Morrison from the Territorial Land Office. These are my associates, Mr. Barnes and Mr. Kelly." Eleanor's blood chilled. This wasn't the kindly Doc Morrison she knew. This was someone else entirely, someone with official authority and unclear motives. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Colt's voice was carefully neutral. "We're here about some irregularities in the water rights documentation for this area," Morrison said, dismounting with practiced ease. "It seems there may be some questions about the validity of certain claims." "What kind of questions?" Morrison pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and withdrew several official-looking documents. "Questions about whether certain recent marriages constitute valid grounds for transferring water rights between properties." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. This was about her marriage to Colt and the water rights that came with it. Someone was challenging their arrangement, and the implications were terrifying. "My marriage is completely legal," Colt said evenly, "performed by a licensed minister and properly recorded." "Oh, the marriage itself isn't in question," Morrison replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. "It's the motivations behind it that concern us. The territorial government takes a dim view of marriages of convenience designed to circumvent water rights regulations. On whose authority are you investigating this matter?" Morrison's smile widened. "Let's just say that certain interested parties have raised concerns about the concentration of water resources in private hands during a time of regional drought." Eleanor felt pieces clicking together in her mind. The Eastern investors Colt had mentioned they weren't just interested in partnership. They were actively working to undermine his position, using official channels to challenge his access to her water rights. "I'll need to see your credentials and any warrants or court orders authorizing this investigation," Colt said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Of course," Morrison said, producing another set of papers. "Everything is in order, I assure you. We'll need to speak with your wife as well. These matters often require testimony from both parties to a marriage." Eleanor made a quick decision and wheeled herself onto the porch, her chin raised with the dignified authority she had once commanded in her classroom. "I'm Mrs. Maddox," she said clearly. "What exactly do you need to know?" Morrison's gaze fixed on her wheelchair, and Eleanor saw calculation in his eyes. "Mrs. Maddox, we need to establish the circumstances surrounding your recent marriage. Specifically, whether it was entered into freely or under any form of coercion." The question was loaded with implications. If Eleanor claimed coercion, it could invalidate the marriage and strip Colt of any claim to her water rights. It could also free her from an arrangement she had entered under false pretenses. All she had to do was tell the truth about Colt's manipulation, and she would be free. But freedom would come at a price. Without Colt's protection, she would be vulnerable to these same men and their unnamed interested parties. Her water rights would become a target for whoever had sent Morrison and his associates. She would be alone again, facing threats she was ill-equipped to handle. "My marriage was entered into freely," Eleanor said firmly, reaching over to place her hand on Colt's arm. "My husband and I may have had practical considerations, but that's true of many frontier marriages. No one forced me to do anything." She felt Colt's muscles relax slightly under her touch, and saw Morrison's expression tighten with frustration. "I see," Morrison said, "and you're aware of the value of your water rights and how they might benefit your husband's business interests." "I'm aware that my husband is an honorable man who married me despite my disability, not because of my property," Eleanor replied, allowing steel to enter her voice. "If you're suggesting otherwise, I'd like to see your evidence." Morrison studied her for a long moment, clearly reassessing his approach. "Of course not, Mrs. Maddox. We're simply conducting a routine investigation to ensure that all water rights transfers are properly documented and legitimate." "Then you'll find everything in order," Colt said. "Unless you have specific charges to bring or warrants to serve, I believe your business here is concluded." Morrison and his associates remounted their horses, but the threat in their departure was unmistakable. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Maddox. This investigation is far from over." After they rode away, Eleanor and Colt stood on the porch in silence, watching the dust clouds settle in the distance. Finally, Colt turned to her with an expression of gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Eleanor replied, still staring down the road, "because whatever problems we have between us, those men represent something much worse." "What do you mean?" Eleanor looked at him directly, her resolve crystallizing in the face of external threat. "I mean that I've made my decision, Colt. I'm your partner now, not your victim. And anyone who wants to take what's ours will have to go through both of us." Eleanor's journal lay open on her dresser, its pages filled with careful observations and growing revelations about the man she had married. What had begun as a simple record of daily events had evolved into something more complex, a map of her own, changing understanding, and an anchor for her sanity in a situation that grew more complicated by the day. October 15th. Colt found Miguel's young son Carlos caught in a flash flood near the creek. Spent 3 hours in the cold water rescuing the boy and getting him to safety. When I thanked him, he looked genuinely puzzled, as if risking his life for a child was simply what any decent person would do. There are depths to this man I'm only beginning to glimpse. The incident with Carlos had happened 2 days after Morrison's threatening visit, and Eleanor had witnessed it from her window. The sight of Colt wading into the dangerous current without hesitation had shaken something loose in her carefully maintained emotional distance. A man who would manipulate a disabled woman for her water rights shouldn't also be the kind of man who would risk drowning to save a child he barely knew. October 18th. Colt worked until midnight, repairing the roof leak over my classroom so the children wouldn't have to sit in the cold. When I offered to help hold materials, he gently suggested I stay warm inside, but not in a way that made me feel useless. He's learning to navigate my independence the way I'm learning to navigate his secrets. Eleanor closed the journal and moved to her window, where the October landscape stretched away in shades of gold and brown. The trees along Willow Creek were beginning to turn, their leaves catching the afternoon light like scattered coins. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache with unexpected belonging. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Eleanor, could I speak with you for a moment?" She opened the door to find Colt standing in the hallway, his expression troubled. He had been quieter than usual since Morrison's visit, spending long hours riding the property boundaries and checking on the cattle with an intensity that spoke of deep worry. "Of course. Come in." Colt entered her room and stood awkwardly near the dresser, clearly uncomfortable with the intimacy of being in her private space. His eyes fell on the open journal, and Eleanor saw him carefully look away, respecting her privacy even in his distraction. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about my family, about why I'm really so determined to get our ranch back." Eleanor settled her hands in her lap and waited. Over the past weeks, she had learned that Colt revealed information the way some people shed layers of clothing reluctantly and only when absolutely necessary. "The ranch wasn't just lost to drought," Colt began, staring out her window at the land beyond. "My father made some poor decisions after my mother died. Started drinking heavily, gambling with money we didn't have. When the drought hit, we were already in debt to some dangerous people. What kind of dangerous people? The kind who don't accept excuses or payment plans. Colt's jaw tightened. When my father couldn't pay, they made examples of him. Beat him badly enough that he never fully recovered. He died 2 years later, still broken by what they'd done to him. Eleanor felt a chill of understanding. The people Morrison works for, are they connected to the ones who hurt your father? Possibly. The Eastern Investment Group has ties to some unsavory financial interests. They specialize in acquiring property from desperate people, often through methods that skirt the edge of legality. And you think they're trying to do the same thing here? Colt turned from the window to face her, his expression grim. I think they're trying to control the water rights for the entire valley. Your spring is the key piece. Without it, their development plans can't move forward. But with it, they can effectively control every ranch and farm in the area. Eleanor absorbed this information, feeling the weight of responsibility settle around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. So by marrying me, you weren't just trying to rebuild your family's ranch. You were trying to stop these people from gaining control. Both, Colt admitted. I won't lie and claim it was entirely altruistic. I want my land back, and I want justice for what they did to my father. But I also believe that stopping them from monopolizing the water rights is the right thing to do, even if it means manipulating an innocent woman to achieve your goals. Colt flinched as if she had struck him. No, that was wrong, and I've regretted it every day since our marriage. But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. If these people succeed, it won't just affect us. Every family in Dry Creek will be at their mercy. Eleanor wheeled her chair closer to where he stood, studying his face in the fading light. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to stay, to fight this with me instead of walking away. I know I have no right to ask that after what I've done, but, Colt, Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm, I already told Morrison that I'm your partner. I meant it. Relief flooded across Colt's features, so profound that Eleanor realized he had been genuinely afraid she would abandon him. The vulnerability in his expression touched something deep in her chest, a place she had thought was permanently hardened against this man. Thank you, he said quietly. I promise you won't regret trusting me. I'm not trusting you, Eleanor replied. I'm trusting the situation. These people threaten everything I care about: my students, my community, my independence. Fighting them serves my interests as much as yours. Colt nodded, though she thought she detected disappointment beneath his acceptance. Fair enough. What do you need to know about what we're facing? Everything. If I'm going to be your partner in this, I need to understand all the pieces. They spent the next hour going over documents and maps that Colt retrieved from his hidden strongbox. Eleanor learned about water rights law, development contracts, and the complex web of financial interests that surrounded their small corner of the territory. The scope of the threat was larger than she had imagined, but so was the potential for resistance. The key, Colt explained, pointing to a legal document, is that water rights transfers require the consent of both spouses. As long as we're married and in agreement, they can't force a sale or transfer. But they can make our lives very difficult. They already are. Morrison's visit was just the beginning. They'll try intimidation, legal challenges, maybe even violence, if they get desperate enough. Eleanor felt a shiver of fear, but also a strange exhilaration. For the first time since her accident, she was facing a challenge that had nothing to do with her disability. She was needed, not in spite of her limitations, but because of her strengths, her intelligence, her legal rights, and her determination. What's our next move? She asked. Colt looked at her with something approaching admiration. We need to strengthen our legal position. I want to consult with a lawyer in Canyon Ridge, someone who specializes in territorial water law. But first, I need to ask you something. What? Are you prepared for this to get dangerous? Because once we start fighting back openly, these people will see us as serious threats. Eleanor thought of Carlos, struggling in the floodwaters, of Mary's bright face as she practiced her letters, of the peaceful life Dry Creek had built along the creek that bore its name. All of it depended on the spring that bubbled up from her land, the water that had become both blessing and curse. "I've been in danger since the day you married me," she said firmly. "At least now I know what I'm fighting for." A smile ghosted across Colt's features, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since their wedding day. "You're remarkable, you know that?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. "I'm practical. There's a difference." "No, there isn't. Not in this case." They were interrupted by Miguel's voice calling from the front of the house. "Mr. Colt! Mrs. Maddox! Come quickly!" Eleanor and Colt exchanged alarmed glances before hurrying to the front room. Miguel stood by the window, his face grave as he pointed toward the road leading to town. "Smoke," he said simply, "coming from the direction of Dry Creek." Eleanor felt her heart stop as she saw the dark column rising against the evening sky. It was too large to be a cooking fire or even a normal house fire. Something significant was burning. "The school," she whispered, though she knew her old cabin-turned-classroom wasn't large enough to produce that much smoke. "No," Colt said grimly, already reaching for his coat and gun belt. "That's coming from the business district. Miguel, saddle my horse." "Eleanor, I need you to stay here where it's safe." "Absolutely not," Eleanor said, wheeling toward the door. "If something's happening in town, I'm going with you." "Eleanor, it could be dangerous." "Those are my people down there, Colt, my students' families. I'm not hiding out here while they might need help." Colt started to argue, then seemed to recognize the futility of the effort. "All right, but you stay close to me, and if things get bad, you do exactly what I tell you." The ride into town took 20 minutes in the modified wagon, 20 minutes during which the smoke grew thicker and more ominous. As they crested the hill overlooking Dry Creek, Eleanor gasped at the sight below. The general store was engulfed in flames, its wooden structure collapsing in on itself, while bucket brigades fought desperately to keep the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings. People ran back and forth in the orange-lit chaos, their faces streaked with soot and fear. But what made Eleanor's blood run cold was the sight of men on horseback at the edge of the firelight. Men who looked very much like Morrison's associates, watching the destruction with calculating eyes rather than helping to fight the flames. "This wasn't an accident," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "No," Colt agreed, his hand moving to his gun. "It wasn't. They're sending us a message." As they approached the edge of town, one of the mounted figures noticed their wagon and spurred his horse toward them. Eleanor recognized him as Barnes, one of Morrison's companions from their earlier visit. "Terrible tragedy," Barnes called out as he rode up beside them. "Old buildings like that, so easy for them to catch fire, especially when folks aren't careful with their lamps and such." "Is that what happened?" Colt asked mildly, though Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. "Oh, who can say?" Barnes replied with a cold smile. "Accidents happen all the time in small towns. Of course, sometimes they happen more often when folks don't cooperate with lawful investigations." The threat was unmistakable. Eleanor felt anger rise in her throat like bile, hot and bitter and demanding release. "Mr. Barnes," she said sweetly, "I certainly hope you and your associates will be cooperating fully with any investigation into this tragic accident. After all, as concerned citizens, I'm sure you'd want to help identify what caused such a terrible fire." Barnes's smile faltered slightly as he realized the double edge in her words. "Of course, Mrs. Maddox, we're always ready to assist local authorities." "I'm so glad to hear it, and I'm sure Sheriff Williams will appreciate your willingness to answer questions about your whereabouts this evening." With that, Eleanor urged Colt to drive the wagon toward the fire, leaving Barnes behind with his smile completely gone and something much less pleasant in his eyes. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Colt murmured as they drew closer to the chaos. "Probably both," Eleanor admitted, "but I'm tired of being afraid of these people. If they want a fight, they can have one." As they joined the bucket brigade and began helping where they could, Eleanor felt something crystallize inside her chest. The scared, desperate woman who had agreed to marry a stranger for financial security was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. These people had threatened her community, endangered innocent families, and tried to use fear as a weapon. They had picked the wrong woman to intimidate. Eleanor Grace Maddox was done being a victim. The threatening letter arrived 3 days after the fire, delivered by a nervous boy who claimed a stranger had paid him a nickel to bring it to the ranch. Eleanor read it twice before the full implications sank in, and when they did, she felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of everything that had happened. Mrs. Maddox, the letter began in precise handwriting, your late father was more clever than anyone realized, including you. The water survey your husband has been studying shows only a fraction of what lies beneath your property. James Clearwater didn't just buy land with a reliable spring, he bought access to an underground river system that extends for miles in every direction. He kept this secret even from you, but others have discovered the truth. Eleanor's hands trembled as she continued reading. The railroad companies aren't the only ones interested in your water rights. The territorial government is preparing to claim eminent domain over any water sources deemed essential to regional development. Unless you act quickly, everything you and your husband have been fighting for will be taken by legal decree, not purchase or coercion. There is evidence of your father's true discovery, hidden where only you would think to look. Find it before they do, or lose everything. A friend. Eleanor stared at the letter, her mind racing through implications that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. Her father had been a methodical man, careful with both money and secrets. If he had discovered something as significant as an underground river system, he would have documented it, but where? She wheeled her chair to the window, looking out at the landscape with new eyes. Somewhere beneath the rolling hills and scattered trees lay water sources that could transform the entire region. Her 20 acres of seemingly modest ranch land might actually be sitting on top of a fortune that could reshape the territory's future. Colt found her there an hour later, still holding the letter and staring out at the land with an expression he couldn't read. "Eleanor?" Miguel said, "Someone delivered a message for you." She handed him the letter without a word, watching his face as he read. She saw surprise, then calculation, then something that might have been awe. "An underground river system," he said quietly. "That would explain why your spring never runs dry, even in drought years. It would also explain why everyone seems so desperate to control my property," Eleanor replied. "The question is, who sent this letter, and why are they helping us?" Colt studied the handwriting again. "Someone who knows more than they're letting on." The phrase, "where only you would think to look," that suggests personal knowledge of you or your family. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. "My father had hiding places, secret spots where he kept important documents, but I thought I'd found them all when he died. Maybe you missed one, or maybe he created a new one specifically for this information." Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to remember her father's habits and quirks. James Clearwater had been a man of routines, but also a man who understood the value of caution. In a territory where land claims could be disputed and valuable discoveries could attract the wrong kind of attention, he would have been careful about documenting anything too significant. "The workshop," she said suddenly. "He had a small workshop behind our old cabin where he did his woodworking. When I moved to the ranch with you, I didn't think to search it thoroughly because it seemed too obvious." "It's worth checking," Colt agreed. "But Eleanor, if this letter is accurate, we're dealing with something much larger than water rights for a few ranches. This could affect the development of the entire territory, which means the people trying to control it have even more at stake than we realized." Colt nodded grimly. "And they'll be more dangerous as a result. If the territorial government is planning to claim eminent domain, our enemies have legal resources we can't match." Eleanor felt a familiar surge of determination, the same feeling that had carried her through the darkest days after her accident. Then we need to find whatever my father hid before they do, and we need to understand exactly what we're fighting for. They made the trip to Eleanor's old cabin that afternoon, with Miguel driving the wagon while Colt rode alongside as protection. The small building looked forlorn and abandoned, its windows dark and its garden overgrown with weeds. Eleanor felt a pang of nostalgia as they approached. This had been her home for 3 years, the place where she had rebuilt her life after everything fell apart. The workshop was a separate structure, little more than a large shed with good light and sturdy workbenches. Eleanor's father had spent countless hours here, crafting furniture and tools with the patient skill of a man who understood wood and metal. The smell of sawdust and oil still lingered in the air, creating an almost physical presence of the man who had shaped her understanding of determination and quiet strength. Where would he hide something he didn't want found? Colt asked, examining the walls and floor for signs of secret compartments. Eleanor moved her chair slowly through the space, remembering her father's movements and habits. He was always checking the moisture levels in his wood storage. Said that properly dried lumber was the foundation of any good project. She directed Colt to a corner where her father had kept his seasoning wood, stacked in careful rows with gaps for air circulation. Colt began moving the boards systematically, and halfway through the pile, his fingers found something that wasn't wood. "Here," he said, pulling out a waterproof oilskin packet. "This is it." Eleanor's heart pounded as Colt brought the packet to her. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of protective material, were documents that made her breath catch in her throat. There were geological surveys, water table measurements, and detailed maps showing an underground river system that stretched from the mountains to the distant valley floor. But the most stunning discovery was a letter addressed to Eleanor in her father's careful handwriting. "My dear daughter," it began, "if you are reading this, then the secret I have carried for 10 years has finally become too dangerous to keep hidden. The land I bought for our family sits above one of the largest underground water sources in the territory. I discovered this by accident while drilling our well, but I have spent years quietly documenting the full extent of what lies beneath our feet." Eleanor continued reading with growing amazement. This water could support thousands of people, transform the desert into farmland, and make our territory one of the most valuable in the nation. But I have also learned that such discoveries can destroy the people who make them if the wrong interests become involved. I have told no one about this, not even you, because I wanted to protect you from the attention it would bring. But I have documented everything, and I leave the decision about what to do with this knowledge to your wisdom and judgment. The underground river connects to water sources on federal land, which means any development would require government approval and oversight. Use this information wisely, my daughter. It could secure your future, but it could also destroy your peace. With all my love and faith in your strength, your father, James Clearwater. Eleanor sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of the situation became clear. Her property wasn't just valuable, it was potentially one of the most important pieces of land in the entire territory. The water beneath her feet could transform the region's future, support massive development projects, and generate wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. "Eleanor," Colt said quietly, "this changes everything." "I know." Eleanor stared at the maps and surveys, trying to absorb their implications. "The question is, what do we do with it?" Before Colt could answer, Miguel's voice called urgently from outside the workshop. "Mr. Colt, riders coming fast!" Eleanor and Colt exchanged alarmed glances before Colt quickly gathered the documents and stuffed them back into the oilskin packet. Through the workshop's small window, Eleanor could see a cloud of dust approaching on the main road, multiple horses moving at speed toward their location. "How many?" Colt called back to Miguel. "6, maybe 8. They're not riding like friends." Colt's expression hardened as he secured the documents inside his coat. "They must have been watching us, probably followed us from the ranch." Eleanor felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. We can't let them get these documents, Colt. This information could control the future of everyone in this valley. We won't, Colt said grimly, checking his gun. But we need to get you out of here safely first. No, Eleanor said firmly. I'm not running away while you fight our battles alone. We're partners, remember. Colt looked as if he wanted to argue, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut off any debate. The riders were close now, and through the workshop's windows, Eleanor could see men dismounting and spreading out to surround the building. Mrs. Maddox, a familiar voice called from outside. Mr. Maddox, we need to have a conversation. It was Morrison, and his tone carried the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. Eleanor felt her jaw tighten with determination as she realized that the real fight was just beginning. What do you want, Morrison? Colt called back, positioning himself near the door with his hand on his gun. I want what your wife's father hid in that workshop, and I want it now, before this situation gets any more complicated than it needs to be. Eleanor and Colt looked at each other with grim understanding. Their enemies had known about the hidden documents all along, had perhaps been waiting for Eleanor to lead them to the exact location. The letter, claiming to be from a friend, had been bait, drawing them into a trap. Seems like you already know what we found, Eleanor called out, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. What makes you think we'd just hand it over? Morrison's laugh was cold and humorless. Because, Mrs. Maddox, the alternative is much less pleasant, and because we have something you might want to see. Eleanor heard sounds of commotion outside, men moving, horses snorting, and then a voice that made her blood turn to ice. Miss Eleanor? It was Mary Henley's voice, small and frightened. Miss Eleanor, are you there? Eleanor's heart stopped. They had taken one of her students, an 8-year-old child, and were using her as leverage. The cruelty of it took her breath away, but it also crystallized her resolve in a way that nothing else could have. Let the child go, Morrison, Colt called out, his voice deadly quiet. Whatever you want from us, she has nothing to do with it. Oh, but she does, Morrison replied. She represents what happens to people who don't cooperate with lawful authorities. We wouldn't want any accidents to befall the children of Dry Creek, would we? Eleanor closed her eyes and felt something fundamental shift inside her. These people had threatened her community, burned buildings, and now they were using a child as a weapon. They had crossed a line that made any compromise impossible. Colt, she said quietly, whatever happens next, we don't give them those documents. Whatever my father discovered, it's too important to let these people control it. Colt nodded, his expression grim but determined. Agreed. But Eleanor, if things go bad, we go down fighting, Eleanor interrupted. Some things are worth more than survival. Outside, Morrison's voice grew impatient. You have 60 seconds to bring me those documents, or the little girl starts learning about the consequences of adult stubbornness. Eleanor looked at the oilskin packet in Colt's hands, then at his face, and saw her own determination reflected in his blue eyes. They had been brought together by deception and manipulation, but they were united now by something stronger, a shared understanding of what was worth fighting for and what was worth dying to protect. The underground river that flowed beneath their feet had carved its path through solid rock over thousands of years, patient and persistent and unstoppable. Eleanor thought of that hidden strength as she prepared to face whatever came next, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Outside, Morrison began counting down from 60, but Eleanor was no longer listening to his threats. She was listening instead to the sound of water moving through darkness, carrying life and possibility to places that had never known either. And she knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who depended on the hidden river flowing silently beneath their feet. Colt's father's revolver lay heavy in Eleanor's lap, its weight both foreign and oddly comforting as she checked the cylinder one more time. Colt had pressed it into her hands with quiet intensity, his blue eyes meeting hers with an understanding that transcended words. The weapon represented choices that neither of them had wanted to make, but circumstances had a way of stripping away everything except the essential. "I've never fired a gun before," Eleanor had whispered as Morrison's countdown continued outside the workshop. "Point it at whatever you want to stop moving," Colt had replied grimly. "Pull the trigger if you have to. The gun will do the rest." Now, as they waited in the tense silence that followed Morrison's ultimatum, Eleanor found herself thinking not about the weapon in her hands, but about the choice that had brought them to this moment. She could have given Morrison the documents. She could have traded her father's secret for Mary's safety and her own survival. It would have been the reasonable thing to do, the practical choice that preserved life over principle. But some things, Eleanor had realized, were worth more than safety. The underground river that flowed beneath their feet represented hope for hundreds of families, the possibility of prosperity that could transform the entire region. In the wrong hands, that same resource could become a tool of oppression, a means of controlling every person who depended on its life-giving water. 30 seconds, Morrison called from outside, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Eleanor looked at Colt, who stood beside the workshop's single window with his rifle ready, and saw her own determination reflected in his weathered features. Somewhere in the past weeks, their marriage of convenience had transformed into something else. Not love, perhaps, but a partnership forged in mutual respect and shared purpose. They had both been shaped by loss and hardened by necessity, but they had found in each other a strength that neither possessed alone. "Miguel," Colt called softly to his ranch hand, who crouched near the workshop's back door with his own Winchester ready. "How many can you see?" "8 men, Mr. Colt, all armed. They have the little girl on a horse near the road, well back from the shooting." Eleanor felt a surge of relief that Mary was positioned away from immediate danger, followed by cold anger at the men who would use a child as leverage. These weren't desperate cowboys or even common criminals. They were organized professionals with resources and connections that reached far beyond the territorial boundaries. "There's something else," Miguel continued quietly. "I see smoke rising from the direction of town again. More than one building this time." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "They're burning Dry Creek while we're trapped here." Colt's jaw tightened as the implications sank in. Morrison and his men weren't just trying to acquire the documents, they were systematically destroying anything that might interfere with their plans. The fire that had consumed the general store had been just the beginning. "Time's up," Morrison announced. "Since you seem to need encouragement to be reasonable, perhaps you'll listen to this." The sound that followed made Eleanor's heart clench. Mary's cry of pain and fear as someone deliberately frightened her horse, causing the animal to rear and nearly throw the child from the saddle. It was a calculated demonstration of how easily they could hurt an innocent victim. "The next time won't be just a scare," Morrison called out. "Bring me those documents now, or start counting the cost of your stubbornness." Eleanor felt rage build in her chest like a physical force, hot and clean and utterly focused. These people had threatened her students, destroyed her community, and now they were terrorizing a child to force her submission. Every practical consideration fell away in the face of that fundamental violation of everything she held sacred. "Colt," she said quietly, "I have an idea." He looked at her with raised eyebrows, still keeping watch through the window. "My father documented everything," Eleanor continued, pulling one of the geological surveys from the oilskin packet. "According to these maps, the underground river runs directly beneath the town. If we could find a way to access it, to prove its existence publicly, we could force territorial intervention before Morrison's people can complete their takeover. How do we access an underground river from here?" Eleanor studied the survey maps with growing excitement. "The original well my father drilled, it was deeper than necessary for a normal water source. He must have been testing the extent of the underground system. If we could expand that access point, create a visible demonstration of what lies beneath, the territorial authorities would have to investigate." Colt finished, understanding dawning in his expression. They couldn't ignore evidence of a water source that significant. "But first, we have to get out of here alive," Miguel pointed out pragmatically. "And we have to get the little girl away from those men." Eleanor looked down at the revolver in her lap, then back at the maps that represented her father's lifetime of careful observation and documentation. James Clearwater had spent years protecting this secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Perhaps that moment had finally arrived. "What if we don't try to hide?" Eleanor said slowly. "What if we make Morrison's worst nightmare come true?" Both men looked at her with expressions of confusion and growing concern. "What do you mean?" Colt asked. Eleanor spread the largest survey map on the workbench, pointing to specific markings her father had made. "Morrison wants these documents because they prove what he's trying to hide, that the water rights he's attempting to acquire represent one of the most valuable natural resources in the territory. But what if everyone already knew that? You want to make the information public." "I want to make it impossible to suppress," Eleanor replied with growing conviction. "If we can get word to the territorial capital, to the newspapers, to anyone with legal authority, if we can create enough attention that Morrison can't simply eliminate the evidence, they'll kill us before we can spread the word," Miguel said bluntly, "and they'll still have the documents." "Not if we don't have the documents anymore," Eleanor said with a smile that felt sharp and dangerous. "Not if we've already given them to someone else." Colt stared at her for a moment, then began to grin with the expression of a man recognizing a kindred spirit. "You want to bluff them. I want to make them realize that killing us won't solve their problem anymore, that the secret is already out of their control." Eleanor quickly selected the most important documents from the packet, the ones that clearly showed the extent of the underground water system and her father's careful calculations of its value. These she folded and concealed within her clothing. The remaining papers, while still valuable, were less definitive and could be sacrificed if necessary. "Miguel," she said, "is there any way to get a message to town without Morrison's men seeing you?" The ranch hand considered this for a moment. "There's an old game trail that runs behind the workshop. I could reach the creek, follow it most of the way to town under cover. But what message?" Eleanor took a piece of paper and quickly wrote a note in her clearest handwriting. "Underground river system beneath Dry Creek, confirmed. James Clearwater's geological surveys prove territorial-scale water resources. Territorial authorities must investigate immediately before Eastern interests acquire illegal control. Lives in danger. Send help. Eleanor Grace Maddox, get this to Sheriff Williams, to the preacher, to anyone in authority," Eleanor instructed. "Tell them to send copies to the territorial capital by the fastest means possible." Miguel took the note and tucked it securely inside his shirt. "What about the little girl?" "Leave her to us," Colt said grimly. "We'll find a way to get Mary to safety." As Miguel slipped out the workshop's back door and disappeared into the undergrowth, Eleanor felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. For the first time since her accident, she was facing a challenge that had nothing to do with her physical limitations and everything to do with her strength of character. She was no longer a victim of circumstances, but an active participant in shaping her own destiny. "Are you ready for this?" Colt asked, checking his rifle one final time. Eleanor looked down at the revolver in her hands, thinking of all the times in her life when she had chosen safety over courage, practicality over principle. Her accident had taught her about survival, but this moment was teaching her something else entirely, that some things were worth risking everything to protect. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. Outside, Morrison's voice carried a note of growing impatience. "I'm losing patience with this game. You have 60 seconds to emerge with those documents, or the child pays the price for your stubbornness." Eleanor and Colt exchanged a look of shared understanding. They had bought Miguel as much time as they could, but now came the moment when words would give way to action. Everything they had worked for, everything they believed in, would be decided in the next few minutes. "For what it's worth," Colt said quietly, "I'm proud to stand with you in this." Eleanor felt her heart clench with an emotion she wasn't quite ready to name. "And I'm proud to call myself your partner." As they prepared to step out of the workshop and face whatever waited for them, Eleanor thought of the underground river flowing silently beneath their feet, patient, persistent, and ultimately unstoppable. Like that hidden current, she and Colt had found their way through darkness to emerge into something approaching light. Whether they survived the next few minutes or not, they had chosen to stand for something larger than themselves. In a world that too often rewarded compromise and self-interest, they had decided that some principles were worth dying for. The revolver felt steady in Eleanor's hands as she prepared to discover whether they were also worth living for. The original land grant lay unfolded in Eleanor's hands as she emerged from the workshop, the legal document that had first brought her family to this corner of the territory, serving now as both shield and weapon. Colt walked beside her with measured steps, his rifle held ready but not immediately threatening, while Eleanor's wheelchair moved with dignity across the uneven ground toward the men who had surrounded them. Morrison stood near the road with 5 of his associates, their horses arranged in a loose semicircle that spoke of military precision rather than casual intimidation. Mary Henley sat on a horse beside Morrison, her small face pale with fear, but her back straight with the courage Eleanor had worked to instill in all her students. The sight of the child in danger sent fresh resolve coursing through Eleanor's veins. "Mr. Morrison," Eleanor called out as they approached, her voice carrying the authority she had once wielded in her classroom. "I believe you wanted to discuss some legal documents." Morrison's expression shifted from smug confidence to wary attention as he noticed that Eleanor carried papers openly rather than trying to conceal them. This wasn't the cowering surrender he had expected. "Mrs. Maddox, Mr. Maddox, I trust you've reconsidered your position on cooperation." "Oh, we've definitely reconsidered," Eleanor replied, stopping her wheelchair just outside easy gun range while remaining close enough for conversation. "In fact, we've had several interesting realizations about our situation, such as..." Eleanor held up the land grant, its official seals clearly visible even at a distance, such as the fact that you and your associates seem to have misunderstood the legal status of water rights in territorial law. This document, signed by Territorial Authority 22 years ago, grants my family access to all water sources on or beneath this property in perpetuity. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied the paper. That grant predates current water rights legislation, which means it takes precedence under territorial statute. Eleanor continued smoothly, grateful for the legal research she had conducted in the weeks since discovering Colt's deception. Any attempt to claim eminent domain would require congressional approval, not just territorial authority. "You're bluffing," Morrison said, but Eleanor heard uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Am I?" Eleanor smiled with cold satisfaction. "Tell me, Mr. Morrison, exactly what authority empowered you to conduct this investigation." "Because I've been reviewing territorial law, and I can't find any statute that allows land office officials to threaten private citizens or take children hostage." One of Morrison's associates, Barnes, Eleanor thought, shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Morrison, maybe we should..." "Shut up!" Morrison snapped, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. "Mrs. Maddox, you're in no position to make demands or question our authority." "Actually, I think I am," Eleanor replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You see, while you've been focused on intimidating us into compliance, we've been taking steps to ensure that your activities receive proper scrutiny." Morrison's face went pale beneath his tan. "What do you mean?" Eleanor gestured toward the smoke still rising from the direction of town. "I mean that your rather dramatic attempts to control the situation have attracted exactly the kind of attention you were trying to avoid. Burning buildings in a territorial town tends to bring federal marshals, and federal marshals tend to ask uncomfortable questions about who benefits from such destruction. It was a calculated bluff based on hope rather than certainty, But Eleanor saw her words hit their target as Morrison's composure slipped another notch. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The territorial capital received word about an underground river system beneath Dry Creek approximately 1 hour ago," Colt added, his tone matter-of-fact. "Along with documentation of threats against private citizens and destruction of property. Federal authorities should be arriving within the next few hours." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but Eleanor was ready for that response. "I wouldn't recommend violence, Mr. Morrison," she said calmly, "because even if you eliminate us, you can't eliminate the evidence we've already distributed. Copies of my father's geological surveys are currently on their way to 3 different territorial offices, along with sworn statements about your activities here." "That's impossible," Morrison snarled. "We've had you under surveillance since you entered the workshop." Eleanor smiled with genuine pleasure. "Have you? Then I'm sure you noticed Miguel leaving by the back trail. Or perhaps you were too focused on intimidating a child to maintain proper watch on all escape routes." The doubt that flickered across Morrison's features told Eleanor that her gamble had paid off. They had indeed missed Miguel's departure, which meant her message might actually reach the authorities. "Even if that's true," Morrison said, rallying his confidence, "you still have information we need, and we still have leverage you care about." His hand moved toward Mary's horse, causing the child to flinch with fear. Eleanor felt rage surge through her, but she forced herself to remain calm and focused. "Actually," she said quietly, "I don't think you do." "What?" Eleanor looked directly at Mary, speaking with the gentle authority the child knew and trusted. "Mary, dear, do you remember the emergency procedures we practiced in class? The ones about what to do if adults were behaving badly?" Mary's frightened expression shifted to one of concentration as she recalled their lessons. "Yes, Miss Eleanor." "Good girl. When I count to 3, I want you to slide down from that horse and run toward the creek as fast as you can. Can you do that for me?" "Don't even think about it," Morrison warned, but Eleanor could hear desperation creeping into his voice. His plan was unraveling, and he knew it. "1," Eleanor said calmly, reaching beneath her shawl for the revolver Colt had given her. "Stop this right now." Or 2. Morrison's gun cleared its holster, but Eleanor was already moving. Years of navigating her wheelchair had strengthened her arms and shoulders, and she used that strength now to propel herself forward while drawing the revolver in a smooth motion that surprised even her. 3. Mary slid from the horse's back with the agility of childhood, hitting the ground running just as Eleanor's shot rang out across the clearing. She had aimed not at Morrison, but at the ground near his horse's feet, causing the animal to rear and throw him from the saddle. Chaos erupted as Morrison's associates reached for their weapons, but Colt was already in motion, his rifle barking as he dove for cover behind Eleanor's wheelchair. Eleanor fired again, this time at Barnes, who was trying to get a clear shot at the fleeing child. "Get Mary to the creek," Eleanor shouted over the gunfire, continuing to lay down covering fire with a steadiness that amazed her. The revolver felt natural in her hands now, an extension of her will rather than an alien tool. Colt rolled to his feet and sprinted after the child, his long legs covering ground quickly, while Eleanor continued to harass Morrison's men with carefully placed shots. She had 6 bullets total, and she made each one count, using the weapon not to kill, but to disrupt and disorient their attackers. Morrison scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "Kill them both!" he screamed at his men. "I don't care about the documents anymore." But his associates were already pulling back, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resistance. Eleanor had counted on their being hired professionals rather than true believers, men who were willing to intimidate and threaten, but not eager to die for someone else's cause. "Morrison!" Barnes called out as he helped another wounded man back to his horse. "We need to get out of here, if they really sent word to the authorities. We're not leaving without those documents." "The hell we're not," Barnes shot back. "I didn't sign up to fight a war against federal marshals." Eleanor watched with grim satisfaction as Morrison's carefully organized operation fell apart under pressure. She had been right about their true nature. They were bullies and opportunists, effective only when they held overwhelming advantages. Colt reached the creek with Mary safely in his arms, the child clinging to him with the desperate relief of someone rescued from nightmare. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she saw them reach safety, even as Morrison continued to rage at his retreating men. "This isn't over," Morrison shouted toward Eleanor, his face flushed with humiliation and fury. "You think you've won something here, but this is bigger than you understand." "No, Mr. Morrison," Eleanor replied, still holding the revolver steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I think you're the one who doesn't understand. This was never about water rights or development deals. This was about whether people like you get to destroy communities like ours without consequence." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something like recognition in his eyes, an acknowledgement that he had underestimated not just her determination, but her understanding of what was really at stake. "You'll regret this," he said finally, swinging back onto his horse. "Probably," Eleanor agreed, "but I'd regret surrender more." As Morrison and his remaining men rode away, leaving dust and the echo of threats hanging in the air, Eleanor finally allowed herself to lower the revolver. Her hands were shaking now with delayed reaction, but her heart was steady with the knowledge that she had faced the worst they could throw at her and emerged victorious. Colt and Mary were making their way back from the creek, both safe and whole, despite the violence that had erupted around them. Eleanor looked at the land grant still clutched in her other hand, thinking of her father's patient documentation and her own journey from victim to active participant in shaping her destiny. The underground river still flowed beneath her feet, carrying life and possibility through the darkness toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Just like Eleanor herself, Eleanor's teaching certificate lay spread across the kitchen table like a bridge between her past and future, its formal script proclaiming her qualification to educate the children of the territory in mathematics, reading, and moral instruction. The document had survived her accident, her forced marriage, and now the gunfight that had finally driven Morrison's men from her property. As she smoothed its edges with trembling fingers, Eleanor realized it represented something more than professional credentials. It was proof of her worth beyond her disability, her marriage, or her water rights. 3 hours had passed since Morrison's retreat, 3 hours during which the world had quietly rearranged itself around the choices they had made. Mary Henley sat at the same table, carefully writing a letter to her mother in her best penmanship, her young face serious with the weight of the story she was telling. The child had insisted on staying to help Eleanor record the events while they were still fresh in memory, displaying the same stubborn courage that had carried her through the morning's terror. "Miss Eleanor," Mary said, pausing in her writing to look up with solemn eyes, "when I was on that horse with the bad man, I remembered what you taught us about being brave, even when we're scared." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What did you remember, dear?" "You said that being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do the right thing, even when you are afraid." Mary's pencil moved carefully across the paper as she continued. "I was very afraid, but I knew you would come for me because that's what teachers do." The simple faith in the child's voice made Eleanor's eyes burn with unshed tears. She had spent so much time since her accident focusing on what she couldn't do, what she had lost, that she had nearly forgotten the profound impact she still had on these young lives. "You were very brave yourself, Mary," Eleanor said gently. "When I told you to run, you trusted me and acted quickly. That took real courage." Colt entered the kitchen from outside, where he had been checking the perimeter and watching for any sign of Morrison's return. His face was grim but relieved as he hung his gun belt on its peg and moved to the coffee pot. "Any word from Miguel?" Eleanor asked. "He's back," Colt replied, pouring coffee with hands that showed slight tremors from lingering adrenaline. "Sheriff Williams received your message and has already sent word to the territorial capital. Federal marshals are expected by tomorrow morning." Eleanor felt a surge of vindication mixed with apprehension. "And the fires in town?" Contained, mostly. Morrison's men torched the livery stable and tried to burn the church, but the townspeople organized quickly. Mrs. Henley is coordinating relief efforts for the families who lost property. Mary looked up from her letter with concern. Is my mama all right? Your mama is fine, Colt assured her with gentle warmth. She's helping take care of other people, just like you're helping us by writing down what happened. The child returned to her work with renewed focus, and Eleanor found herself studying Colt's profile as he stood by the window. The events of the day had stripped away the last of his careful facades, revealing a man who was both harder and more vulnerable than she had understood. When Morrison had threatened Mary, she had seen something fierce and protective flash in Colt's blue eyes, not the calculated determination of someone protecting an asset, but the genuine anger of someone defending innocence. Colt, Eleanor said quietly, we need to talk about what happens next. He turned from the window, his expression serious. The marshals will want statements from both of us. Miguel, too, since he witnessed Morrison's threats. Once they have the geological surveys and documentation of the underground river system, the territorial government will have to launch a formal investigation. I mean, what happens to us? Eleanor clarified. To our marriage, our arrangement, everything has changed. Mary looked up from her letter with the sharp attention of a child, sensing adult complexity beyond her understanding. Eleanor smiled reassuringly at her before continuing. Mary, dear, would you mind taking your letter to the front room to finish? I think there's better light by the window there. The child gathered her papers obediently, but paused at the kitchen doorway. Miss Eleanor, are you and Mr. Colt going to keep being married? The directness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. Why do you ask, sweetheart? Because you look at each other different now than you did before. Like my mama and papa look at each other when they think nobody's watching. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as Mary disappeared into the front room, leaving her alone with Colt and the uncomfortable accuracy of a child's observation. She had been trying not to examine her own feelings too closely, focusing instead on the external threats and immediate dangers. But the truth was that something fundamental had shifted between them during the crisis. She's not wrong, Colt said quietly, settling into the chair across from Eleanor. Things have changed between us. Eleanor studied his face, seeing new lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but also something softer, more open than before. When you ran after Mary, when you put yourself between her and those guns, that wasn't part of our business arrangement. No, Colt agreed, it wasn't. And when I chose to fight rather than surrender the documents, that wasn't about protecting my water rights. What was it about? Eleanor considered the question seriously. It was about refusing to let people like Morrison destroy something good. The children's education, the community's future, the hope that this place could become something better than it is. Colt reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Eleanor, I need you to know something. When I first planned this marriage, when I manipulated you into agreeing, I thought I was solving a problem. I thought I was being smart and practical. And now? Now I know I was being a coward. Colt's voice carried deep regret. I was afraid to ask for what I needed honestly, afraid to risk rejection or failure. So I took the certain path, the one that guaranteed I'd get what I wanted. Eleanor felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. What do you want now, Colt? Honestly, I want a real marriage, he said without hesitation. Not a business arrangement or a marriage of convenience, but a partnership between equals who choose to face the world together. I want the right to love you, and I want to earn the right to be loved in return. The words hung between them like a bridge that Eleanor could choose to cross or leave unbuilt. She thought of the woman she had been 6 months ago, bitter, isolated, surviving on charity and the diminishing sympathy of her neighbors. That woman would have seen Colt's confession as another manipulation, another calculated move in a larger game. But the woman she had become during their marriage was different. She had rediscovered her strength, her value, her ability to shape her own destiny. She had learned that love might be different from what she had imagined, not the romantic fantasy of her youth, but something more complex and resilient. "When Morrison's men had Mary," Eleanor said slowly, "when I thought they might hurt her to force our surrender, I wasn't thinking about water rights or land grants or even survival. I was thinking about whether I could live with myself if I let fear make my choices for me." "And what did you decide?" "I decided that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you." Eleanor turned her hand over beneath his, their fingers interlacing naturally. "I also decided that I'd rather face those fights with a partner I trust than face them alone." Colt's expression shifted from hope to something deeper and more complex. "Do you trust me, Eleanor, after everything I've done?" Eleanor considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. "I trust that you're capable of growth, that you've learned from your mistakes. I trust that when the crisis came, you chose to protect what mattered rather than what benefited you most." "That's not the same as trusting me completely." "No," Eleanor agreed. "Complete trust is something that's earned over time, through consistency and honesty, but it's something I'm willing to work toward if you are." Relief flooded across Colt's features, followed by something that might have been wonder. "You're remarkable, you know that? Most people would have run as far as they could after what I put you through. Most people haven't learned what I've learned about the difference between giving up and moving forward." Eleanor smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Besides, where would I run to? This is my home, these are my people, and you're my husband, not just legally, but by choice." From the front room came the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, moving at a measured pace that suggested official business rather than threat. Eleanor and Colt looked toward the window as a small group of uniformed men rode into view, their badges and bearing marking them as the federal marshals they had been expecting. "Ready for the next round?" Colt asked, standing and reaching for his coat. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and smoothed her skirt, feeling the teaching certificate crinkle in her pocket where she had placed it for safekeeping. "More than ready. We have a story to tell, and it's time the right people heard it." As they prepared to meet with the authorities who would determine the future of the underground river system and the communities that depended on it, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had started this journey as a victim of circumstances, manipulated into a marriage that served someone else's purposes. She was ending it as an active participant in shaping not just her own destiny, but the future of everyone she cared about. The teaching certificate in her pocket represented more than professional qualification. It was proof that Eleanor Grace Maddox had something valuable to offer the world, something that went far beyond her water rights or her marriage status. She was a teacher, a protector of children, a defender of community values, and now, finally, a woman who had chosen her own path forward. Mary appeared in the kitchen doorway with her completed letter, her young face bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Miss Eleanor, I finished writing everything down, just like you taught us to do with our lessons." Eleanor looked at the child's careful handwriting, documenting the day's events with the precision and attention to detail that would serve her well throughout her life. Whatever happened next, Mary and her classmates would remember this day as the moment when their teacher chose to fight for something larger than herself. "Excellent work, Mary," Eleanor said, accepting the letter with formal gravity. "This will be very important for helping the marshals understand what really happened here." As the federal officers dismounted outside and prepared to take statements that would reshape the territory's future, Eleanor felt Colt's hand settle on her shoulder with gentle pride. They had come through fire together and emerged, not unscathed, but strengthened, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead as true partners in every sense of the word. The underground river still flowed beneath their feet, carrying life and possibility toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Just like the marriage that had begun in deception and grown into something real and lasting through the crucible of shared adversity. The new school bell gleamed in the morning sunlight, its bronze surface unmarked by time or weather as it hung from the sturdy post Colt had erected in the yard of their ranch house. Eleanor rang it twice, the clear notes carrying across the valley to where her expanded class of 15 students was making its way along the improved road that now connected the ranch to Dry Creek proper. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Morrison and his associates. 6 months that had transformed not just Eleanor's life, but the entire character of the region. The federal investigation that followed had exposed a network of land speculation and water rights manipulation that reached from territorial offices to eastern financial centers. Morrison himself now faced federal charges, while the underground river system had been declared a protected territorial resource, ensuring that its benefits would serve the broader community rather than private interests. Eleanor watched her students approach with the satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling expanded rather than diminished by circumstances. The ranch school had grown from necessity into choice, as families throughout the valley recognized the quality of education their children received here. What had begun as Eleanor teaching from her wheelchair in a makeshift classroom had evolved into a proper school building that Colt had constructed over the winter months, complete with desks, blackboards, and even a small library. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor," called Rebecca Thompson, now 12, and serving as Eleanor's informal assistant with the younger children. "Tommy brought his arithmetic problems to show you, and Mary has finished reading the entire McGuffey reader." Eleanor smiled at the familiar ritual of morning greetings, each child stopping by her chair to share their accomplishments and receive encouragement for the day's lessons. These interactions had become the foundation of her days, providing purpose and joy in ways she had never expected when she first agreed to Colt's marriage proposal. "Excellent work, all of you," Eleanor replied, ringing the bell once more to officially begin the school day. "Please take your seats while I mark attendance." As the children settled into their desks, Eleanor heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats and looked up to see Sheriff Williams riding toward the school building. He had become a regular visitor since the federal investigation, partly for official reasons, and partly because his own grandson had joined Eleanor's class. The sight of him no longer caused the flutter of anxiety it once had these days. His visits usually brought good news about the legal proceedings or updates on community developments. "Mrs. Maddox," Sheriff Williams called out as he dismounted, "sorry to interrupt your lessons, but I've got some news I thought you'd want to hear right away." Eleanor excused herself from the classroom, rolling her chair out to the porch where they could speak privately. "What is it, Sheriff?" "Got word from the territorial capital this morning. The Water Rights Commission has made their final ruling about the underground river system. Your property has been designated the primary access point for the new territorial water management system." Eleanor felt her heart skip. What does that mean, exactly? It means the government is offering to purchase a perpetual easement for water access, not the land itself, mind you, but the right to manage water distribution from your spring. The compensation they're offering is, well, it's substantial. He handed her an official document that made Eleanor's eyes widen as she read the figures. The government was offering enough money to ensure security, not just for her and Colt, but for the entire community's future development. "There's more," Sheriff Williams continued. "They want to establish a territorial school here, with you as the head teacher. Full government salary, benefits, and funding for expanded facilities. They're calling it the Clearwater Educational Institute, after your father." Eleanor stared at the documents, hardly able to process the magnitude of what was being offered. Her father's careful documentation of the underground river system had not only protected the community from exploitation, but had opened doors to opportunities she had never imagined possible. "There's no pressure to decide immediately," the sheriff added kindly, "but the territory wants to move forward with the water management project by spring, so they'll need an answer within the month." After Sheriff Williams left, Eleanor sat on the porch for several minutes, absorbing the implications of what she had learned. The scared, desperate woman who had married Colt Maddox 6 months ago could never have imagined finding herself in a position of such influence and opportunity. The journey from victim to partner to community leader had been neither smooth nor predictable, but it had led her to a place of genuine fulfillment. "Eleanor?" Colt's voice interrupted her thoughts as he approached from the barn, where he had been working with a horse that had thrown a shoe. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What did the sheriff want?" Eleanor handed him the documents without a word, watching his expression shift from curiosity to amazement as he read. When he finished, he looked at her with something approaching awe. "Eleanor, this changes everything. You could have financial independence, professional recognition, everything you've ever wanted." "Could have," Eleanor repeated thoughtfully. "The question is whether it's what I want now." Colt settled onto the porch step beside her chair, his expression serious. "What do you mean?" Eleanor gestured toward the schoolhouse, where she could hear the children reciting their multiplication tables in unison. "6 months ago, I would have jumped at an opportunity like this. Financial security, official recognition, the chance to build something permanent and important. But now I'm not sure I want to be the head of a territorial institution. I like what we've built here, Colt. I like teaching children who walk 2 miles through the mud just to learn their letters. I like being part of a community rather than being an official representing the government." Colt was quiet for a moment, studying her face with the careful attention she had come to value in their marriage. "Are you saying you want to turn down the offer?" "I'm saying I want to negotiate it," Eleanor replied with a smile that felt both mischievous and determined. "The water easement offer is generous, and we should accept it. The community needs that water management system, but the school proposal needs modification." "What kind of modification?" Eleanor looked at the new school bell, thinking of all the changes it represented and all the possibilities it symbolized. "I want to remain an independent teacher, not a government employee. I want the freedom to teach what I think is important, not just what some territorial education board decides. And I want the school to remain part of this ranch, part of our life together, rather than becoming some distant institution." Colt's expression brightened with understanding. "You want them to fund the school without controlling it." "Exactly. Let them pay for books, supplies, even additional teachers if enrollment grows. But let the Clearwater Educational Institute remain what it is, a place where children learn not just reading and arithmetic, but how to think for themselves and stand up for what matters." From inside the schoolhouse came the sound of young voices raised in a geography lesson, discussing the rivers and mountains that shaped their territory. Eleanor listened to the eager questions and thoughtful answers, feeling a deep sense of rightness about the life she had chosen. "What about us?" Colt asked quietly. "What about our marriage, our future together?" Eleanor reached over and took his hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "What about it? We've built something good here, Colt. Something real. Why would we want to change that?" "I just want to make sure you're choosing this life because you want it, not because you feel trapped by circumstances." Eleanor looked at him directly, seeing the man who had evolved from manipulator to protector to genuine partner over the course of their unusual courtship. "I'm choosing this life because it's the one I want to live. With you, in this place, doing this work. Not because I have to, but because I choose to." The relief and joy that crossed Colt's features made her heart clench with affection. Whatever their marriage had begun as, it had become something neither of them had expected, a true partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and growing love. "There is one thing I want to change, though," Eleanor added with a smile. "What's that?" "I want to expand the garden behind the house. If we're going to be teaching 15 children on a regular basis, we should grow enough vegetables to feed them properly. And I think we should add chickens, maybe even a milk cow." Colt laughed, the sound rich with contentment. "Anything else you'd like to add to our domestic arrangements?" Eleanor pretended to consider this seriously. "Well, I've been thinking we should host a harvest dance this fall. Give the whole community a chance to celebrate the good things that have come from all this upheaval." "A dance," Colt repeated with amusement. I should probably warn you that I'm not much of a dancer." "That's all right," Eleanor replied, glancing meaningfully at her wheelchair. "Neither am I, technically speaking, but I think we could manage something." As if summoned by their conversation, Mary Henley appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, her face bright with the news she was bursting to share. "Miss Eleanor, Mr. Colt, we just finished reading about the Colorado River, and Tommy wants to know if our underground river is bigger than that one." Eleanor and Colt exchanged amused glances before Eleanor called back, "That's an excellent question, Mary. Why don't you and Tommy research the measurements and present your findings to the class tomorrow?" "We will." Mary disappeared back into the schoolhouse with the enthusiasm of a child given an important mission. Eleanor looked at the new school bell one more time, thinking of all the mornings it would summon children to learning, all the lessons it would mark, all the growth and discovery it would witness. Like the underground river that flowed beneath their feet, education was a force that shaped the landscape quietly but permanently, carrying knowledge and possibility to places that had never known either. The woman who had agreed to marry Colt Maddox 6 months ago had been desperate and afraid, grasping at any chance for security in an uncertain world. The woman who sat on this porch now was neither desperate nor afraid, but purposeful and content, surrounded by work that mattered and love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. Eleanor Grace Maddox had found her place in the world, not despite her disability, not in spite of her circumstances, but because of her own strength and the partnership she had built with a man who had learned to value her for all the right reasons. The future stretched ahead of them, like an unwritten lesson plan, full of possibilities they would discover together. The school bell caught the afternoon breeze and gave a soft, musical ring that seemed to carry across the valley like a promise of good things to come.